Hello and welcome to the BICOM podcast. I'm Richard Pater, the director of BICOM, and today is Thursday, the 7th of November. We are a day after Trump's election victory, and today's episode focuses on the Trump presidency and what it could mean for the region here. To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast Professor Jonathan Rynhold. Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
My pleasure, Richard. Thank you.
So for background, Professor Rynhold is the head of the Department for Political Studies and the academic director of the Jonathan Sachs Institute at Bar Ilan University. His expertise includes US-Israeli relations, Israeli foreign policy, and the role of political culture in foreign policy. Most relevant for today, amongst his variety of things that he has written, he is the author of a book entitled The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture. He, like myself, comes from the UK and has a PhD in international relations from LSE, and he's also served in the past as a visiting professor at George Washington University in Washington, DC. So, Jonathan, if we can start perhaps and focus on where we are at the kind of the tail end of the Biden administration and what we think will happen kind of in the next 2 or 3 months in the context of the end of the term. And I suppose most specifically, I'm aware that the deadline is reaching next week of the letter that was sent by both Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense regarding the amount of humanitarian aid into Gaza. So what do we think when that deadline comes up, and what else can we expect from Biden?
Well, I think the first thing we should say is this period between the election result and January the 20th, when the new president takes office, the president is often termed a lame duck. And that's because in terms of domestic politics, he has very little leverage, very little political capital to do things. But in foreign policy, it's the opposite, in the sense that he's freed from any electoral considerations. So he's free to do unpopular things that would be unpopular with the American public, and which it's very hard for Congress to block him. So historically, when Ronald Reagan recognized the PLO, he was doing something that was electorally unpopular in America, but he was free from the consequences, and so it was easier to do it. So with President Biden, we're now entering that period. And as you mentioned, the letter that was written to the Israeli government, signed by the Secretary of State for Defense, said that if Israel does not increase the humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza, then there will be consequences for the supply of weapons to Israel by the United States, because there are laws in place in America which say that if you're not satisfied with fitting in with American law on these issues, then you're not supposed to provide weapons. And what we know so far is that although Israel has increased the number of trucks going into Gaza compared to when the letter was sent, the number of trucks going in is nothing compared to what it was in April of this year, when Israel dramatically increased very, very quickly the number of trucks going into Gaza for a similar reason, an imminent threat from the US that it would not support Israel and that would cut offensive arms to Israel. So I think that we can assume that the administration will be willing to pressure Israel regarding the supply of offensive weapons. I very much doubt that President Biden would be willing to do so with regard to defensive weapons. I think his support for the defense of Israel is personal and rock solid. And any time it has been suggested that perhaps America should go further within the administration, he blocked it personally.
And just on the other side of the coin, in that same period where we have you referred to the kind of the lame duck period at the tail end, President Trump has kind of boasted that he expects kind of foreign policy achievements even before taking office. Is there any precedent for a incumbent president involving himself in foreign policy even before he is sworn in?
So it's more a case that often the president who is leaving office will consult with the incoming president. But I think in this case, what President Trump is trying to suggest is that even before entering office, he will already start negotiations with, I presume, Saudi Arabia and others, and will be working on that angle. I think that's what he's referring to.
Okay, well, I'll come on to Saudi Arabia perhaps in a little bit. But if we start kind of from Israel's perspective, closer to home, the fighting on the ground in Gaza has now been going on for over a year, whilst the campaign in Lebanon, though more limited, for just over a month. What's your assessment and kind of how this is going? And again, how the American political scene would affect Israel's decision-making on those two fronts?
I think the first thing to say is that while the war in Gaza was a shock to Israel and to the defense establishment, that in part was because Israel's been preparing for 20 years for the type of war that we've been involved in, both in Lebanon and the attacks from Iran. There are annual military exercises between Israel and the United States for many years now, which the main scenario is about defending Israel from missile attack and the like. And so I think what we can say is the success of Israel in Lebanon went far beyond what even the most optimistic person in the know would have thought was possible beforehand. Most people were predicting that electricity power stations would be hit and that we would not have enough electricity and that thousands of Israeli civilians would die and that buildings would come down in Tel Aviv. So when you take that into account, I think it's quite astonishing, actually, that within a short space of time, Israel has neutered 2 of Iran's proxies and left Iran itself open to attack. So I think militarily it's been a massive success. The difficulty for Israel is always converting military success into diplomatic and political gains. Levi Eshkol, who was Israel's prime minister in the Six-Day War, referred to Israel in this regard as Samson the Nebuch.
And on that, kind of following on the diplomatic front, kind of, and how this war ends, obviously, kind of high in Israelis' minds is the ongoing situation with the hostages, and perhaps if there's any criticism of the US that not enough pressure was brought to bear, I would say particularly on Qatar, but potentially on Egypt as well, to not in turn place more pressure on Hamas. Do you think if the hostage situation is still in place, that Trump would be more effective in that role?
The only reason that Trump might be more effective is not to do with pressure on Qatar and Egypt. It's rather to do with the fact that he may say to the Israelis, look, I want this over quickly, so do what you want to do now. And I'll give you a certain number of days. You know, I'm not so picky as or conscious of human rights issues or civilian casualties as the Biden administration. So just go ahead, but know that you're going to have to finish very, very quickly. Now, if Hamas gets wind of that through Qatar, through Egypt, that may have an impact.
Well, let's hope that the hostage situation is resolved before January, but people here are obviously incredibly concerned about that. Let me ask you a different track about kind of the personal relationship that we saw kind of develop into a very close ties between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump in the first term. There was kind of since then subsequent comments reported in Barak Rabin's book over kind of being upset that Netanyahu apparently congratulated Biden too soon, whilst President Trump didn't recognise the results of that election. But where do you think relations stand now? And kind of in a wider scheme, how important are those personal ties?
So, President Trump, for President Trump, the most important thing is that political actors, show personal loyalty to him. And he thinks much less in terms of state interests and much more in terms of loyalty to him personally. On the other hand, he's also extremely transactional. So I think it would be a mistake to say that they were ever close. I think it would be correct to say that Mr. Trump President Trump felt that he needed to be seen to be pro-Israel because his base of support in the Republican Party is pro-Israel evangelicals. Evangelicals make up 60% of the base of the Republican Party, and he needs to get them out to vote in order to win. And so I think that was the major factor. So, for example, when they did move the embassy to Jerusalem, it was a pastor, one that had even made anti-Semitic comments, who actually led the religious aspect of the ceremony and not a rabbi. And I think that tells you something about what was really driving Trump. Of course, he was influenced by his son-in-law and his former accountant and his former lawyer, who led his team. Note, they were all personally loyal to him. And this time, it may be different because he is probably not going to try and change the constitution or have a coup so that he can go beyond 4 years. So he doesn't need the evangelicals in quite the same way. And he has already given them a reversal of the Roe versus Wade decision on abortion. So Mr. Netanyahu, I think, will have to be much more careful because if President Trump thinks what he's doing is not in America's interest, I don't think he'll hesitate to let it be known. The only thing that might constrain him is that depending on who he picks as his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, they have a different understanding of relations with Israel. They see Israel as much more of an ally and strategic asset, and also, for religious or for cultural reasons or ideological reasons, support Israel. So they would be less inclined to confront Israel, and many of them have good, relations with Netanyahu.
It just reminds me of another personal relationship that Israel will be losing now, is following the sacking of the Defense Minister Gallant, who held very close and intimate relations with Defense Secretary Austin over this last year. How do you think that his replacement, Israel Katz, who obviously doesn't have such a military background, will cope with that liaison role, and will that come at the detriment of Israeli security?
So I think that the Americans will miss Gallant because he represented a more moderate approach than the one supported by Netanyahu's far-right coalition partners, which Netanyahu often gave way to on what I'd say are non-military matters, so humanitarian aid and things like that. On the military things and the hostages, but on the military things, I don't think there was such a difference actually between Gallant and Netanyahu. I think the Americans will lose someone who can put their position better in Israel. I think they will. They've lost someone who's closer to their position. Gallant had a sort of gave them a direct line into the defense establishment, and Katz will be, at least to begin with, will be a yes man to Netanyahu. and he lacks the experience and the connections to move the defense establishment in the way that Gallant, having served at a very high level previously in the IDF, it was able to do. So I think there's a greater chance of more public controversies between the administration and the Israeli government during this period.
Now, turning to the biggest issue, perhaps, which is Iran. And as we're speaking today, kind of the Israeli establishment is on high alert for a potential Iranian response to what happened just 2 weeks ago, the Israeli attack. What do we think that Trump's approach will be to Iran? Do you think he's going to go for a deal? How supportive would he be, kind of in Israel's dreams to take part in a potential joint attack on Iranian nuclear project?
Okay, so I think the first thing we have to do is talk about the Biden administration and what's happening now. And then we'll talk about Trump, because what the Biden administration has indirectly told the Iranians is that I don't know if we will be able to restrain Israel this time. Now, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to take part in an Israeli attack, but when you send B-52 bombers, America's largest bomber, long-range bombers that were designed to be used against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, right? They don't really have a defensive purpose. What they're there to do is to deter Iran. But and how does that deterrence work? It works like this. If Israel attacks you, and you then attack Israel, yeah, and attack our assets, we will have in place bombers that will attack you. In other words, we're not just saying we won't be able to restrain Israel, we're saying we might allow Israel to drag us into it, which is something we've always done our utmost not to have happen, right? That the Biden administration has never wanted a regional escalation, but the president may look at it and say, you know, we've got to, you know, if they didn't want the deal, they're closer than ever to the bomb. You know, if they're stupid enough again, maybe, you know, I'm not waiting for elections anymore. Maybe it's not so bad if Israel leads this, and, you know, if they're open and vulnerable. The only thing is, the only person within the administration I can see really supporting that is the president. I think the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor will not be inclined. I'm not sure about the Secretary of State for Defense. That's maybe might consider it, but I still think that's unlikely. So if we go on to Trump, then I think that within the Trump administration, there will be unanimity on imposing much harsher sanctions on Iran. And the Biden administration has already taken a step in that direction in response to the last attack. But I think we will see much greater, you know, pressure. But I think that Trump himself will be looking to do a deal. He has no problem turning up in North Korea, right? He'll have no problem turning up in Tehran to do a deal. But he did walk away in North Korea. In other words, he offered to withdraw 30,000 American troops from South Korea if North Korea would give up its nuclear program. I don't see him offering to withdraw all of America's forces in the Middle East, but, you know, he could well make a step in that direction if Iran were to give up its nuclear program. So I think on the nuclear program, he sees that as a direct American interest. I don't think he would be rushing to bomb Iran with Israel. I think that he, even more than Biden, does not want to get dragged into a war, a major regional war. But I'm not sure how much support he would give Israel in such an instance, because, you know, rhetorically he'll say, you know, I'm happy to let Israel do what it wants. But for Israel to be effective, it probably needs American support in one way or another, which will, in some sense, drag America in. And it's a question of whether he and those around him are willing to do that or not. So some of them, if it's Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, are willing to do that, or Tom Cotton, who's also been mentioned, who's a senator. But others, like the Vice President, Vance, are much less likely. They do not see Iran as the same level of threat to the US as it is to Israel. And the same goes more broadly for Iran in the region. In the last Trump administration, the administration did not respond to major attacks on its allies like Saudi Arabia. It only responded, and responded extremely powerfully, when an American citizen was killed. And so it's not at all clear that the administration would be committed to containing Iran actively in the region, right? Some people would be behind that, and some people less so. Stopping Iran going nuclear with more sanctions, yes. Stopping Iran in the last resort using force or backing Israel, unclear. Depends who has the president's ear.
We'll have to wait and see on all of that, but thank you. And as you mentioned earlier, kind of the on the other side of the coin is kind of this grand bargain, or kind of the tantalizing potential for Israel to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, which were already kind of being hinted at during the last Trump administration, and obviously famously brought together the Abraham Accords countries. How do you rate the prospects of this deal and normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia?
So the problem really is this, that the normalization is part of a broader deal that would see the signing of a security guarantee, an alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Now, what happens in order to make such a commitment? You need a majority in the Senate. So the president can sign an agreement, it's called an executive agreement, but the next president can say, I'm not going to follow it. If it receives congressional backing, then it's what we call a treaty, and then the next president can't just say, it doesn't bind me. It binds the next president, it binds future presidents. That's what the Saudis want. And the only way that the majority of Democrats, or sufficient number of Democrats, would have voted for that is if it was President Biden's plan. And so the question will be whether there are, enough Democrats who are willing to go for it in order to make that deal possible. One thing that might make it possible is if Israel says something like recommits to a two-state solution, an over-the-horizon two-state solution. That was President Biden's term, over the horizon, i.e. not tomorrow, and something about Gaza that Saudi Arabia and everyone can live with, which would be not controlled by Israel, not administered by Israel, but by some Palestinian, not necessarily the Palestinian Authority fully, but some kind of relationship with them. And then if the Israeli right says no to that, Trump will get very angry. In other words, Trump really wants to say, I made peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And if Israel starts, if the Israeli right start going on about settlements, I don't think he's going to like it. I don't think he's going to be particularly bothered about the exact security arrangements, with Gaza, and whether the PA is on the border or not on the border. Those things are going to bother him less. What will bother him is that giving the Saudis enough that they say yes to normalization with Israel that will allow him to get it through the Senate, right? Because he'll need a few Democrats. And I think this government is under a bit of an illusion if it thinks it can have its cake and eat it. Having said that, it may well be that it's just not possible to do this deal. And therefore, Trump will not be knocking on the door saying, stop your settlements or do this or do that, because he wants to stay out of it as much as possible.
So the other problematic element of the US-Saudi defense deal is whether it challenges Israel's long-standing arrangement with the US over their qualitative military edge in the region, and kind of will the Saudi demands be as much that kind of Israel can accept that? Where do you see that issue falling from the Israeli perspective?
Okay, so Israel will be very concerned about all of that. But the Israeli dilemma is actually quite complex. In other words, from the Israeli perspective, traditionally, the feeling is it's better that the United States is the supplier of weapons to Arab countries than somebody else. And the reason for that is that if it's the United States, Israel has some say in what they get and what they don't get, particularly because of its support in Congress. The qualitative edge is a legal requirement. So that makes it very powerful. And the other thing is, if somebody else supplies these things, if the Saudis are determined to get them, so the Americans wouldn't sell them drones, so they bought them from China. So it's better, the general rule since the 1960s has been that, Israel prefers the US to supply, knowing that the US can then shut off that supply and that they can have an influence on what's supplied. And this goes all the way back to the middle of the 1960s when Jordan threatened that it would buy Soviet tanks if the Americans didn't sell them tanks. So it's not a new thing. It's a standard thing. But of course, we watch very carefully what they actually do sell.
And the other complicated, if we go by what was kind of we understood where the negotiations were last time round, the other criteria that the Saudis are looking for is the right to enrich for civilian purposes, nuclear enrichment on their soil, unlike the Emirates, for example, that are doing it off with the South Koreans, I think. So kind of where would Israel stand on that clause?
So all of that's very much related to what happens with Iran. Right. What the Obama administration did in the Iran deal was allow Iran to enrich uranium on its soil, which it hadn't allowed the UAE to do. And that's where the Saudi claim comes from. So if the Iranian nuclear threat, one way or another, is pushed back very significantly, then I would say that the Saudis' emphasis on that issue would be much, much less. The choice, I think, for the Americans is a security guarantee or enrichment on your own soil. Now, the Biden administration very much preferred the security guarantee. It could well be that the Trump administration, and the president particularly, does not like committing to other countries' security. Right? That's not America first. America first is a term used by isolationists since the 1930s. So he may prefer enrichment of uranium on Saudi soil. And there was certainly talk of nuclear deals between Saudi Arabia and the United States during the first Trump administration. And, again, that was a case of Israel trying to limit what went on there rather than stop it altogether, because obviously it's better that Americans supervise what is going on rather than the Saudis just getting one from Pakistan and being sort of more loose in it. So I think that is something very, very much to watch. And in some ways, I think the threat of that is a little bit higher now than it was under the Biden administration.
And just closer to home here in Israel, you mentioned briefly the kind of the Palestinian front and what Trump is or isn't interested to do there. But I just wondered whether we could see a resurrection of the Trump peace plan and whether that has still relevance.
I don't think so. It's possible. I think it's a mistake to think of Trump as someone who's interested in the details. So I think Trump wants some kind of a deal. So both for personal reasons, ego, but also because if there is some kind of a deal, then it means America has to do less. It's calmer here, and Israel and Saudi Arabia can cooperate vis-a-vis Iran, and that costs America less money and less resources. And if there is one theme to Trump on foreign policy, which he's pretty consistent on, it's that he wants America to play a smaller role in the world, doesn't want to waste American resources as he sees it on allies and wars. He prefers do a deal and walk away. Now, that may be somewhat of an illusion, but I think he consistently takes that line. So when it comes to the Palestinians, I think what will interest him is less the details and more just simply, is it enough to get the result I want, which is an Israel-Saudi normalization, or is it not? I think he's not interested in the deal for itself. He knows that the Palestinians won't accept it, so he doesn't want to have a failure, right? So I would look at it like that.
Okay, and one final question. If we just focus on Israel-US relations, and we've seen kind of the what's happened on US campuses over the last year, one of the principles of Israeli engagement with the US is to keep Israel as a bipartisan issue. Kind of in the wake of a Trump victory, what can Israel be doing to kind of to maintain appropriate ties with the Democrats?
So I think this is something where you have to look outside the government. First of all, whoever's in power in Israel or in any other country will have to show a degree of support for the Trump administration that's unusually high because of this issue of loyalty. But the real key for Israel is on a much deeper level, and that is that it is losing very much the younger generation. Until 2015, every major demographic group polled in the United States was pro-Israel. Okay? And that they sympathized with Israel more than the Palestinians by at least 2-1. Democrats fell from 2-1 in favor of Israel consistently in from 2015 to 2020 to a dead heat. Okay, so the Democrats are divided right down the middle. But among young Democrats, they're massively more pro-Palestinian. If you're under 25 and even quite extreme anti-Israel views. And so really it's very important for different parts of Israeli society to engage with their counterparts in the US. And that is whether you're an academic, a lawyer, a doctor, all those things. That is the way the special relationship was built originally, through trade unions and journalists and societal. And it also means that the opposition needs to be very active in talking to Democrats about an alternative vision for Israel. What the Democrats need is potential leaders in Israel with whom they can identify. So otherwise, they will go to increasingly to the more radical anti-Zionist elements. They will be drawn to them if they don't have people they can identify with, who they can say, well, I don't support the Israeli right, but I like, Yair Golan or someone like that. Or why do I say Yair Golan? I say because on military matters, he's quite hawkish, but on the Palestinians, he's very dovish. And therefore, because he's very dovish on that, he gets a hearing on the military things, which are much more consensual in Israel. And therefore, he's a very good person to put in front of a Democrat audience in America. Although, you know, his diplomatic skills are less than Yair Lapid, so they should probably go together.
Well, maybe you're suggesting some political alignment on the centre-left there, but we'll discuss that on another occasion. Professor Rynhold, thank you very much indeed for sharing your insights and joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Richard. Thank you for having me.